Welcome to a Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis Last Week, our interview series. I have to give my standard disclaimer. By night, I fight crime as a mass vigilante, but by day, I practice cannabis and/or psychedelics and/or IP law with the law firm Zuber Lawler. So any opinions that I state are my own and not those of Zuber Lawler. And with that, I have the pleasure of introducing and sitting down with Nancy Whiteman, founder and CEO at Wana Brands. Thank you so much for taking the time at the busy Benzinga conference to have a Cannaconvo with me.
Thank you so much for interviewing me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I have to ask, right, because obviously this is major news in the industry. And just personally for you, when you started your business career,
yes,
did you ever think that you'd enter into a transaction that would be conditional upon the federal legalization of a drug?
I knew right from the start. I just had the opportunity to speak actually on the stage with David Klein, who's the CEO of Canopy. And my comment is that this probably takes everybody who knows me now a little bit by surprise that I'm in cannabis at all, except for my friends from high school who are not at all surprised.
It's come full circle. That's what people say to me too.
Yeah. So no, but having the deal contingent on the federal permissibility is certainly a wrinkle that I didn't anticipate.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now that there's been some time since the deal and everything, the transaction, the announcement, I'm curious to know, in terms of how it's played out, the benefits, the unexpected aspects of it. Just curious to, hear about that.
Well, from my perspective, it's been nothing but a positive. We chose our partner very, very carefully in Canopy, and they have been everything that we have hoped for and more in terms of, being a great partner to us. So all extremely positive on that front. And then the other thing that I would mention, which has been a huge positive, is that the transaction enabled me personally to start a private foundation, which I have named the Wana Brands Foundation in honor of where the money actually came from. So that's been amazing. I really just can't tell you how strongly I feel that we are here to make the world a better place, and to have the opportunity to do that's really something amazing.
Yes. And I think that it's a unique industry, right?
Yes.
And I think that I'm seeing, covering the podcast and covering all the news from the macro perspective, it's very, very nice to see an increasing emphasis from, the larger companies that have this capacity, right, to do good like this.
Yes.
And you particularly just had a wonderful program just yesterday.
Yesterday.
To coincide with 420. So
yes,
yeah.
We so actually we started this idea last year. We call it Forward 20 because the thought is that we should be playing it forward in terms of using cannabis to do good in the world. And so we did a really fun and exciting campaign this year where we gave each of 14 different nonprofits in each of our 14 states $10,000 donation, and they are all around the topic of food insecurity and many different interesting models. So, in Colorado, we partnered with We Don't Waste, which is an organization focused on not wasting food. We worked with organizations that put grocery stores with fresh produce into food deserts, community food shares, just a whole range of different models, but all around the topic of food security.
Yes, which is something that unfortunately doesn't get enough, attention,
right,
and is a much larger problem in this country than people realize. So
totally, and it's interesting. Our tagline is "Enhance your life." Right.
Yeah.
And, our feeling is it's awfully hard to think about enhancing your life when you're hungry.
Yeah.
Right. So let's do our part to take care of some of the fundamental foundational issues that people have.
Thank you. Right. Thank you for doing good. Right. I mean, thank you. It's got to be very, reassuring and positive to get in this position where you can on the scale that you had.
And
that
say
the deal enables this.
Yeah, it's a privilege. Yeah.
And I see an emphasis in terms of other players in the industry, heavy hitters, that similar thing, right? And this is a unique industry. And so that was, food insecurity, but the emphasis in this industry on, inclusion, right? And unfortunately, the war on drugs and unequal enforcement has had such negative impacts. I'm seeing more and more now, it's very reassuring that larger companies, right, are investing efforts in things like that. Speaking with, talking about the partnership with Canopy, as you said, right, with the unique idiosyncrasies of this industry and state by state different models, the choice when you establish a brand as strong as yours and how to expand into different markets is such an interesting thing. And so now with this partnership, what are the upcoming plans? What is that enabling you to do? And how are you approaching market expansion now?
Well, interestingly, I would say that how we're approaching it now is identical to how we were approaching it before the transaction. But we have chosen what I would call an asset-light model for our market expansion, which means essentially that we partner with people who have licenses and facilities. Yep. They do the manufacturing for us. We have various agreements in different markets around sales and marketing and who handles that. But we are not having to spend a lot of CapEx to build out all these different facilities. So that strategy continues. And we still think it's the right one. We think it's one that currently works and will also work post-legalization. And just to comment on that, my own working assumption is that even post-legalization, that states will retain pretty broad discretion over their cannabis programs, which means that it's very unlikely for a brand like Wana that we're going to have one single facility in one place that can produce a standard set of products that we can ship across the entire country. We're still going to have to account for state and regional differences. So, that part of it is still in place in terms of how we're expanding. We're currently in 14 states and 9 markets in Canada. And we just launched in Puerto Rico, which is our first foray into Latin America, which is very exciting. We're getting ready to launch in 3 more markets in the next couple of months. And we're in discussions in another 6 markets. So we just have a huge amount of market expansion growth coming. But, it's not without its challenges. What essentially happens with this is that you kind of start over in every new state, and every state is extremely different.
Exactly.
So, a lot of the art of this is really being able to dive into those differences state by state and to put effective strategies in place at the state level, as opposed to thinking maybe more like a national CPG brand where you have a national strategy and you roll it out. Here you really have a series of market by market strategies.
Exactly. And with every state being its own little microcosm, right? So you have such an established brand now, right? That I'm sure everyone would love to work with you, but I'm assuming that it's a matter of going back to the topic of partnerships, right? Going to each state, understanding the different idiosyncrasies and construction of the market, and finding the proper partner for that market.
Yes.
Right.
And you hit the nail on the head, because actually somebody who might be a terrific partner in one market might be a challenging partner in another market. It's such a mixture of different criteria and factors that you need to take into consideration. And some of it really just has to do with the regulatory structure of the state itself.
Exactly.
Is it a limited license market? Is it an unlimited market? What are the requirements around getting a medical card? There's just a ton of different nuance. And then, of course, there's just the sheer size of the market.
Yep.
But sometimes you have a market that has the potential to be enormous. I'll use New York as an example.
Yes.
And, there for the last X number of years, as long as medical's been a program, it's been a very small constrained market.
Exactly.
Because of the regulatory structure.
Yep.
So, like I said, you really need to look at all of these factors together when you're putting together an expansion strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And the rollout going from medical to adult use can be surprising in certain ways, right? New York had this surprisingly restricted medical program. Flower wasn't permissible. And now, with MRTA and stuff in the bill, it's incredibly liberal in certain ways by comparison to other states. Like it doesn't necessarily affect edibles, but you could smoke on the street.
Yeah.
Right. And so here's another interesting question, right? So you can pick a partner when it's a medical market, but then is there a consideration of, is this going to be the proper partner when it expands to adult use and shifts in ways that you can't necessarily predict, but that has to factor into it as well?
It absolutely does. And, it's interesting. We were just having a discussion with one of our partners in the last couple of days. And the discussion was about what is this market going to look like when it flips from medical to adult use? Because it could look very different. It could look like Arizona, where suddenly we had enormous price compression practically overnight. Tons of competition flooding into the market. Or it could look like Illinois, where there's still a lot of constraints on biomass and those things hold prices up, right? So you have to be prepared with different strategies, and your partners do as well, based on what the reality is when a market goes from medical to adult use. It is not a uniform thing in any way.
Exactly. So, anticipating flexibility, as a strength and a partner is something you have to take into consideration.
To your point, capacity is a big issue, right? So, if you're going into a market where that there's a high likelihood that it's going to shift from being a medical market to an adult use market, that's a conversation you need to be having early on with a prospective partner. How are you going to scale? What are your plans for this? How are you thinking about it?
Exactly. And there are a lot of very, very, promising markets that will be coming online, and I always like to play Tokerdamus, right? And there's some exciting markets like Missouri, Ohio, though I was shocked by the polling numbers that came out recently in Ohio. They were a little bit surprising, but a lot of exciting markets. So one of the things I think is, I always talk about is with brands and products is the Canna Curious and the connoisseurs and catering to them. And so, you have a broad range of products, right? And an approach. And so I'm curious to know, as the market is developing and also the shift that we're seeing in terms of distribution models, right? How in more mature markets, delivery is increasing.
Yes.
And I'm also personally very excited about on-site consumption and seeing how that's going to affect general stigmas. And, when people are out and proud and people see that it's not like a bar where people are stumbling out.
Right.
So I'm curious to know in terms of what you're working on in the innovation pipeline and like catering to these different demographics and the different distribution models.
Well, it's interesting. I think that there's a number of ways to conceptualize cannabis consumers. And I think Canna Curious versus connoisseur is definitely a legitimate way to look at it. I think we tend to look at it maybe a little bit differently in terms of our product line. So let me talk a little bit about that. So we have kind of our classic product line, which is a distillate-based gummy. It's terpene enhanced. It's great tasting, scalable, doesn't melt, blah, blah, blah. It's a great product. But it's not our innovative product line either.
Okay.
So in the last couple of years, we've come out with our Wana Quick product line, which is our fast onset edible. We mostly work in the gummy format. So everything that I'm saying, I'm putting it through that lens. And it's, by far the best-selling fast onset gummy on the market. That was really driven more, I think it's driven more by situation. So lots of time, myself included, I love those gummies for social situations, right? They're wonderful. They come on fast within 15 minutes. Similar, it's a Delta 9 experience because it bypasses metabolism in the liver. So it doesn't turn into 11-hydroxy. Cool product, great product. But when I want to sleep, I take a classic gummy because it lasts longer. And then we have our Wana Optimals line, which is our use case specific line, highly formulated. All those products, right now there's 2 in the product line, but there's many more in the pipeline, have very, very sophisticated formulation where it's a combination of THC, different minor cannabinoids, depending on the effect that we're going for, and a lot of coactives and functional ingredients. So to me, that in terms of slicing things, that one is sort of squarely aimed at a health and wellness user.
Okay.
We just released our live rosin gummies, which are just taking off really, really well in Colorado. And they also have the quick onset technology built in. And that one is an interesting one because going back to your connoisseur, that is the connoisseur product, right? That's for people who want the full complex entourage effect. But I also think that because they're getting the entourage effect, there's actually some health and wellness benefits in it. And I look forward to figuring out how we're going to expand that line to include more of that. We're just huge believers that you build a strong brand on uniqueness and differentiation. And our strategy is to go towards high value added products. So that's kind of where we are in the innovation pipeline.
And I think that you have this, like with this broad options of products, right? First off, I think that the development of rapid onset technology was so instrumental, right? In terms of, and I think specifically with respect to the Canna Curious, in the sense that people who smoke, right, there is a feedback system. They exhale, they know how much potentially to expect that's going to happen, right? And it was such an issue with, I think specifically with the Canna Curious with edibles, is I call it the double dose edible problem, right? They forget that it's going to take 40 minutes. They, take it again. I may or may not be married to anyone who this happened to accidentally at some point, right? And you also have the people who are never really going to be comfortable with smoking, right? And so rapid onset, pioneering that was such a huge thing. And then, watching how the markets develop, when I talk about the connoisseurs in Colorado, there is that 30%. And typically, right, I think they prefer smoking because they know their strains, they know their terpene profiles, but you've created, right, there's an edible catering to them. And as you said, it's doing very, very well. And the other point that you speak to that I find very, very appealing is the entourage effect, the effects of some of these minor cannabinoids that are very, very exciting for specific use cases. And one of the things that excites me is medical, pharmaceutical grade deployment of these for treatment of different cancers, but also on the consumer side, right? You can tailor, like you said, I think you're guided by use cases to a certain extent too. Yes. So you're excited about the prospect of, a CBG, which I call my second favorite cannabinoid, obviously CBN for sleep. So you are excited about continuing to develop down these very, very specific pathways.
Yes.
Yeah. So to circle back, right, in the limited time that we have, I also thought, so you have a unique perspective, right? This macro perspective, you expand into all these states, you built this brand. And I thought it was very interesting. I talk about playing tokerodamus, your concept of what federal legalization can end up playing out like, right? The idea that, and I had my recap episode recently, and the idea that no matter how it ends up playing out, right, it's not going to be something where you're shipping, right? You have the cheapest production facility and you're crossing state lines. You believe, and I agree with you, that ultimately the model will be respect the states. I mean, we have the States Act, right? That is there. It hasn't ultimately made progress. But I'm curious to your thoughts. What do you think, the market will look like 5-10 years down the road? Some thoughts on legalization, how that plays out, and how brands will play out, right? Because now we have the West Coast is established, the East Coast is coming online.
Right.
And there's the discussion of, the established brands, will they come there? Will there be new brands sprouting out of, I'm from New York. We're very proud, right? We're very.
And I think there's always this natural tension between West Coast and East Coast, whether it's rap or whatever it is, right? There's a divide there. So I do think that East Coasters, and I'm also from New York.
There you go.
So I think East Coasters will in fact begin to evolve their own brands. I also think the major brands will be there.
Yeah.
Who are the major brands today, which are primarily from the West.
Exactly.
Right? So I think we're going to have both. When I think about legalization, though, as you said, I agree with you. I don't see one uniform anytime soon, one uniform set of product specs or regulations or anything like that. But what I do think legalization is going to offer us beyond the obvious, which is being able to ship across state lines, being able to source biomass much more effectively at a much lower cost. There's a whole bunch of things that will happen and efficiencies that come from supply chain and being able to order, on a more massive basis. So there's clearly a lot of economic benefit for the brands. But I think one of the major things that it's going to do, and this could even happen prior to legalization with the research bill that's chugging along, but when we get more robust research, that's going to power and enable and inform much more effective products. And when we have much more effective products, particularly on the health and wellness sort of use case specific side, then we start moving into a world where cannabis is not just seen as another recreational option, but it's seen as a health and wellness option, something that I can take instead of Ambien, something that I can take instead of Xanax. You name the things that we all know that cannabis is being used for already. What we don't have yet is kind of the clinical research that's robust enough to have doctors and medical professionals say, I think this is the thing you should use.
Yeah.
Right?
And we're making good progress. I just covered in the podcast last week, the University of Mississippi's monopoly since 1968 is finally it was just, the first time you hear that in the industry, you're like, what an absurdity.
Yes.
Right. Like how did that happen? Right. How did that last?
Being used for our research, right?
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah. It's just absolutely flabbergasting to me. And so I agree with the excitement. And the other thing I'll say, right, in terms of the brands that are going to come on the East Coast and, continue the national promises, you've been through the crucible. Your brand has risen to the top, right, based on quality in this incredibly unique market, right, where you're finding the right partners, taking into consideration all of these factors. And also, I mean, you have to be standing over them, right? To ensure that there's that same quality in each state.
Yes.
Right. I mean, you have the technology, you have the rapid onset, you bring things to the table.
You have to build the whole internal infrastructure to actually do that successfully. I think brands that try to expand into other markets without having that internal structure really struggle.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing I think is interesting, right? We're making progress on the research side, right? Mm-hmm. There are different bills. There are there's bipartisan support. Yeah. It's almost crazy that there hasn't been more progress. But I think that one of the things that interests me is, this idea of being out and proud in terms of consumption, and that on-site consumption will feed into that, right? Totally. That it all goes together, that you're removing the stigma. I also think that it's, you're busting stereotypes, right? That people are just used to seeing from movies or whatever. And I think it's almost the idea that I try to tell people, don't think of cannabis as one drug, right? At all. Right. I mean, we were scratching the surface. You were saying the exciting stuff about the different cannabinoids and the different use cases. And it's almost like it's myth busting to a certain extent as part of our job, your job, with all the products that you offer, to understand that it can have all these different effects. Yes. And as you said, tying that to health and wellness. Ultimately.
Exactly. And, to your point on social consumption and how that will break down stigmas, I think that's a great example of another big thing that I think legalization will do for us, which is I think it's going to open up distribution opportunities. And I think that's super important because the dispensary model is very limiting in some ways in terms of getting innovative product to the market. Most of them are small, right? They don't have a huge amount of shelf space. And so they do what's a totally logical thing to do, really, which is I'm going to go for high velocity mainstream products.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
So once there's a true DTC models are in place or other types of distribution, all of a sudden you can begin to get more expansive with your product development.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because now there's shelf space and avenues to actually get it out to consumers. So that's the other thing that I'm very optimistic about with legalization.
No, I agree. And we're going to wrap up. And one thing I'll say is, I like to say I drank the can of Kool-Aid, right? I'm in the Cannabis Beverage Association. That's one, segment that'll just open up with that model. Right. And your continued expansion as well. Thank you so much for taking the time, during Benzing and everything. And this was great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. All right.